In those days, Luke begins. Now, Luke is, of course, looking back because he's writing his gospel a good 70 to 80 years after Mary and Joseph's journey. But Luke isn't primarily interested in telling history here. His primary interest is giving a theological interpretation of history, of time itself. But before I put you to sleep, just give me a chance here. He's juxtaposing our world's version of history, its story of power and who counts, with God's story of power and who counts. And he's challenging us to make a decision about which story will you find yourselves in. Now, we gather all of this, scholars have, because Luke's historical details are a bit off. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own towns to be registered. The problem is that, as scholars have long pointed out, there was never an empire-wide census conducted by Caesar Augustus. And we know this because Rome, like every empire, was very good at record keeping, especially when it came to taxes. And that's what a census was really about, counting people so you knew how much they owed you. Now, Quirinius did conduct a census of Judea, but it wasn't until he became governor of Syria in about the year 6 AD. So again, the facts of history are less important for Luke than the truth that he is trying to convey about history, about the world. A truth that, if we listen closely, if we get it, is meant to change how we, as hearers of the gospel in every time and place, understand and live in our own historical moment. So not just once upon a time, but in our own moment. And that is, in one version of history, time is marked by those who wield worldly power. In those days, Emperor Augustus ruled and Quirinius was his governor. In those days, George VI was king of the British Empire. In the days when Abraham Lincoln was president, when Donald Trump was president of the United States, right, we mark eras of history by rulers, by dynasties. Time is marked by those with the power to issue decrees like the emperor and executive orders that affect all people from the greatest to the least. Decrees that force people like Mary and Joseph to travel a great distance with no real concern for the burden that it might place on them. Those who are poor and have no power, those who are looked down upon and ridiculed, like them. In this telling of history, marked as it is by worldly rulers, the lives of the lowly, the poor, can be upended at any moment, whenever an emperor or empire deemed it convenient. And again, a census whose main purpose was to count people for the sake of taxation, well, that was about as good a reason as any. In those days, Luke is saying, in history as our world marks it, counts it, the powerful are the ones who count, who truly matter, whose lives really matter, who are worth noting. The poor masses, of which Mary and Joseph were a part, they counted not for the sake of representation, not because they mattered. No, they counted for the sake of taxation. As in most empires, in Mary and Joseph's world, the poor and lower classes were disproportionately taxed compared to their wealthier counterparts. And once again, it's clear from Roman records that tax levies in provinces like Judea pushed vulnerable populations to and sometimes beyond the brink of desperation. In this world, there is no room for people like Mary and Joseph, whose resiliency, whose will to live forces them to turn a stable into a birthing room, an animal's feeding trough into a cradle. In history, as our world tells it, this is just the natural order of things. This is the way things are, even if we can admit that it's a bit unfortunate for those caught on the underside. But who would dare imagine it any other way, right? It's far easier to just blame the poor for their situation and insist that they just work a little bit harder to change their circumstances, right? Mary and Joseph, you just keep climbing that ladder. You can do it. Anybody can do it. It's your fault if you don't. It's much easier to do that than to insist that the world could be, or perhaps should be, ordered in another way. And yet this is exactly what Luke does. Luke puts the story of God revealed in and through Jesus on a crash course with the story of history as told according to our worldly rulers. Indeed, in those days, marked by the rule of Emperor Augustus, who had declared himself the Son of God, who had statues erected and poets proclaim his gospel as one whose rule brought peace to all the world, the greatest peace, by the way, that anyone had ever known, who proclaimed the good news of himself as Savior, the Lord of Lords, they called him, the light of the world. In those days, Luke says, marked by the names of the powerful and the insignificance of the nameless, poor, and dispossessed masses. In those days, amidst these dynamics which mark our world in every time and place, Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem. He went there to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for her to deliver, and she gave birth to her firstborn and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, in an animal's feeding trough, to be clear, because there was no room for them in the inn. That is, whereas our world counts time and people according to worldly values and status and power, God's story counts time and people in a radically different way. In God's story, history is marked not in relation to Augustus, to rulers, but in relation to the poor and dispossessed, to Mary and Joseph. They are the protagonists. Salvation comes not from the halls of power in Rome or Washington, Luke is saying, but from Bethlehem, from one born in a remote village in Afghanistan, in a refugee camp in Syria, from Honduras or the south side of Chicago. Though you are considered last and least in the eyes of the world, the prophet Micah declares, salvation for all the world shall come from you. The key to the good news of God is not Augustus or any other ruler. No, the Christ child is poor, is vulnerable, disenfranchised. The one who was born among the animals and placed in a bacteria-laden feeding trough because no one was willing to make room for him. This one is the real Son of God, our Savior. This one is the light of the world. If you want to know peace and joy, Luke is saying, if you want to encounter the light that shines in every darkness and that darkness will never overcome, you'll have to find it here. Not in Rome, not in Washington. You will have to make room for this child and this family. See, the problem with our world, the reason that history's story keeps repeating itself with all of its violence and war and disenfranchisement and exploitation and scapegoating, is that we, like those in the days of Mary and Joseph, we keep looking to our rulers to save us. But the primary interest of rulers in every age is maintaining their power and influence, whether for themselves or for their party. But Advent and Christmas are an invitation to live fully in our historical moment, but to do so within the framework of God's story, to shift the center from the powerful to those on the margins, those who occupy the position of Mary and Joseph and Jesus in our world. Because in the end, we cannot hope for true peace. Our world will never truly know joy, will never be characterized by the reign of God's love until we can find God in the manger. Until we are willing to make room for the holy families of our world crossing rivers and deserts to arrive at our borders. Until we are willing to meet God in the hood or in the camps, in those places like Bethlehem that are deemed the last and the least place for holiness to arrive. Until we are willing to honor the resilience of the disenfranchised and the mischaracterized. For inasmuch as we refuse to find God here, we refuse to welcome the Christ who is born of Mary among the animals in Bethlehem of Judea. Beloved, at Christmas, we are reminded that the meaning of God's advent, of the arrival of the God who takes on human flesh, is that our salvation lies in meeting God in such places in our world. As long as they exist, our story makes it clear God will be waiting for us in the manger. The question in those days and our own is, are we prepared to house the holy presence of God? Will we be among those who choose to make room? May it be so, that our weary souls may rejoice, that the weary world may rejoice,